hopefully that is starting to show. Right, let's work out what we're doing and get going. Thanks for your patience, everyone, as I've just been trying to get online, but let me just try and load that up. In the meantime, I need to just double check that I can see it on YouTube. If I can get to YouTube. Yeah. Well, I can see my slides, so that's a good sign. Right, let's go with that then. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone, for turning up this morning and to talk about swarm programming. Now, this is something that I have been looking at because the emerging use of AI in my area of work, anyway, is increasing all the time. But where we seem to have accelerated slightly is it feels like the use of skills and Claude Code's championing of those as a developer vehicle seems to have accelerated the thinking around this space, at least certainly from my point of view. So I'm sure that there are going to be people that are ahead of where I am, but I just thought it was useful, especially when we're talking about guardrails, to look at what is the current state, as at least from my viewpoint. So, a couple of years ago, we were still marveling at AI writing functions and being this all shiny new IntelliSense, and that we were not needing to go to Stack Overflow anymore, and wasn't it great? And now that we've seen to have got used to agentic as a word that's entered our dictionary, that we can now allow a process on our behalf to run commands, edit multiple files within a project workspace, and work on a longer task until completion. And then we've seen sort of tools access being increased, so you can now connect your agent to third-party tools or data sources through MCP. And then you started to see things like desktop browser control and quite scary other things like that felt like we moved from AI being an assistant that was effectively just yours to do some intelligent refactoring with. We then moved into the sort of co-pilot phase where it was a pair programmer almost. We're now at agentic, where it feels like we're now saying we will create an agent that actually does things on our behalf rather than something that we're pairing with. And the purpose of today's talk is to also then look at where that might lead and already is leading for some people. The old model was one human, one AI model having one conversation, which was helpful, but it was still fundamentally at the early adoption stage. It was still a tool in the hands of a developer, not necessarily across wider business. What's changed though is it feels like we're at a position where that unit of automation is moving agentically from a task to now, can I actually break bigger problems down by modeling what a team is? So instead of actually being, I'm going to pick up a user story to do a very small piece of work to my code base and describe that as a task, now potentially we've got the ability to actually look at modeling wider problems and allowing a team of agents to do that. And so it's no longer the question of saying, can AI help me do something? It's now, can I define repeatable behavior that I'm not having to tell it how to approach a task every time? But then in the back of my mind, certainly when people start to get a bit nervous about what it could do in your name, how do we constrain its authority and then also establish ways of getting those things to calibrate safely? The unit of value now starts to become, especially where source control is used and should be used, it now becomes a pull request that represents the value that the agentic system has has changed, rather than here I've just given you a code snippet, does this look okay? So it's basically taking a step backwards. And this isn't brand new. I mean, a lot of this stuff is has been around for years now. I mean, there's all but a couple of years ago that, you know, research papers like MetaGPT was talking about how we could create agents that work together. But it feels like, because the large providers of LLMs like Anthropic and OpenAI and Google are starting to look and make it more visible to people about what these things are, that we've had technology change behind the scenes, like larger context windows allowing you to actually have more code considered or more information considered while processing a request. We've had things like increase of tools usage, so the ability to plug it into Google Workspace or GitHub. The fact that now you've got the ability to have long-running agents, not necessarily locked to your machine anymore. The idea that you can actually just kick it off as a cloud task and get something else off your machine to actually carry on doing something for potentially hours, not just minutes. So it kind of feels like the tool makers have been explicitly pushing tools for building these agents and the reusable skills that allows us to not have to repeat ourselves so frequently, especially now that we're then saying they can also interact with tools to like source control or pull requests to actually give us the output in a pull request. We're also getting tooling that are able to run for longer and actually almost self-critique and self-plan. So in the past, a lot of the skill set a few years ago was being talked about as to prompt engineering was going to be an emerging skill, to say, I need to know how to talk to these. And I still think that that's valid. In some ways, I find, playing with this technology myself quite a lot, that getting AI to help you write the prompt to prompt better is actually kind of a bit meta, but it also does seem to produce some pretty amazing results. So we've got the ingredients now for delegation, but not just, it's not just assisting us anymore. But so effectively, when I'm saying swarm programming, it's a bit of a buzzword, but effectively what I'm meaning is a pattern where the software delivery work that we typically do as engineering teams becomes split across several defined AI roles with agents and having distinct goals with tools and boundaries themselves, potentially coordinated by a lead agent or potentially a human. So it's not magic, it's just about actually thinking about what do I need to do to potentially speed up some bits of it. But, like most things, you probably are going to spend longer creating your guardrails and setting it up than you potentially are. So it's not necessarily that every system needs this many agents. You're not going to go approach every problem and go, I need 8 virtual agents to help me solve this problem, when actually you just want to refactor something fairly small. But the opportunity here is to actually start looking at, are there opportunities, especially if you are less skilled in one particular area, like you might want to carry on coding, but you might not be so confident testing. So actually getting an agent to do the testing for you and actually calling out where you might want to make improvements might be a sensible way of actually bolstering your skills. So the attraction is decomposition of the effort rather than necessarily trying to completely remove yourself from the loop. The danger with this, of course, is the increased need for auditing and accountability, which is what I'll come on to later. So a typical agent's MD file is the kind of thing that's unlocked a lot of this, where it's our ability to have a simple markdown file that actually allows us to say what good looks like. Like, what would I want you to do every single time I'm giving you an instruction? This is off agents.md website, there are plenty of examples out there of things that you can use as an inspiration for how you want it to work. And I think, for me, the most positive thing about this whole revolution, if you want to call it that, is the fact that it's forcing people to actually have the discussions about what this should look like. Because actually, instead of us spending 6 months working in a team and picking it up organically, and actually having to ask people, like, oh, why have you rejected my pull request? Oh, I wouldn't have written it that quite that way. This is actually now starting to say to teams, this is living documentation that should be sat in the project and everyone agrees and can iterate on. So if we find that actually this in a virtual agent isn't doing a good job, you could actually then come back and change these rules every time. So it's kind of, AgentsMD has become effectively the README file for virtual agents. It's a simpler, uncluttered list of instructions that we want it to follow every time, so that you're codifying it and not having to repeat it in every prompt that you put. And that's kind of where this is the foundational layer that's allowed us to then go on to think that agents could actually be defined as more than just that you could actually think about defining what is your persona, how would you behave if this didn't work, what's your I mean, I've seen people even do like personalities, like you're the one that's a bit cautious, you're going to call people out on adding new libraries, you're going to be the one that's being cautious. And so there are things about this that actually then go beyond AgentsMD, so that skills as a concept that Claude seems to have run with is actually almost like atomic things that you want it to do that you're going to define as a thing. Like some of the ones out of the box are things like simplify, where it just looks at code bases and says actually this is too complex. But these kind of things where we're taking a step backwards is not how it does it, it's what is it? What does it embody as a thing? And so actually you start to say that in certain problems that you're asking it to solve, multiple agents can be better than a single one, because sometimes a single agent has to look at a task that you've set it and say, do I understand the problem? Can I inspect the code? I need to design and plan the changes necessary. I need to implement it, verify it, document it, and make some judgment as to whether I've actually done the task. Now, potentially for that to happen within a single thread, I mean, I'm probably using the wrong analogy there, but within a single definition, it can be hard for it to know whether it's done a good enough job. Anthropic talks last year about its research feature, which is effectively just a lot of these models now are actually allowing you to do deep research, where it'll go off, find citations, and build you a document to actually give you a better understanding of where it's come up, and it's not just hallucinated the answer. To power this, what they actually started to do was realizing that having a lead agent that then farms out subtasks, almost having a library assistant to actually go off and find a bit of the problem and come back with the answers and then collated it, was actually far more efficient. So that blog article where they talk about how they built a multi-agent research system goes on about the fact that when asked to identify all the board members of companies in the information technology S&P 500 share index, the multi-agent system found the correct answers by decomposing it into tasks for sub-agents, while the single-agent system failed to find the answer with slow sequential searches. So it actually performed more accurately by dividing the problem and conquering. So in general, when we're talking about software delivery teams, you've got ideation going through to requirement setting, through to, a business analyst will clarify the assumptions and acceptance criteria, and then you get a dev to propose the implementation, and a tester then writes the edge cases to make sure it's done, and we review things through security and other things. And then we work with DevOps teams to get it out the door and implement. And so what we're talking about here is actually thinking about this software development lifecycle and thinking, which bits do I want to improve? Not necessarily take the human completely out of the loop, but it also means that flow is thinking, if I did automate all of that, would I be okay with that? Or what points in that flow would I want humans to be involved? And so the challenge here now is, this is not about replacing a team. In the same way that you could argue that testing is not a tester's job, a tester helps define what goods looks like that the rest of the team could understand. The same is here, where we're saying we're not replacing a team. Everybody that has specializations in this could be responsible for the definition of how these agents work, but they could also be farming work out to make sure that that's being done in maybe a way that scales faster than actually needing to go to market and actually hire more staff. You could use people that have got specializations that remain in the team. So it's about compressing that. We're not trying to digitize people's brains to the point where we can replace them, but the same point is if we can actually help articulate what good looks like for this project, then it helps everybody. And it makes you realize that, like Simon Sinek's book about Start With Why, that actually that sort of circle where we're typically at the what layer on the outside, where we'll approach a task and go, I'm changing this. And you go, okay, but sometimes on the user story, it won't tell you how we're going to do it or why we're doing it. And so in some ways, the more that we take a step back from this and actually have to ask an agent to go off and do something, we have to better understand why we're doing it in the first place. Why are people excited about this? Well, they're so excited because potentially multiple agents can do things in parallel. So therefore, it could be faster, potentially, instead of waiting for one massive thread to spend 2 hours, the idea of farming it out and saying, can you all go and work on this separately? Specialization in terms of actually being able to better define what good looks like for each role, and the fact that the thinking about the output and saying, what do we want as a memory trail or a documentation trail to know what's changed? Again, back to that Anthropic research thing, they also found performance-wise that we found that multi-agent systems with Claude Opus 4 as the lead agent and Claude Sonnet 4 sub-agents outperformed a single agent of Claude Opus 4 by 90.2%. So again, it's just showing that, yes, you could argue that over-dividing a problem and saying, I need a team of 8 virtual agents, might feel like overkill, but also potentially there are speed improvements as well. OpenAI have a thing talking about using skills to accelerate open source. This is fascinating. In fact, now actually we're saying that the open source community relies on people contributing to projects to keep them alive. Well, actually, they've found now that things like repetitive review and validation work are no longer waiting on scarce reviewer time for each low risk change, while maintainers can stay focused on higher context review while their judgment matters most. That shift has helped us move through the backlog bugs and smaller improvements much faster. Now again, this quote seems to generate 2 questions. One is, what is a low risk change? And how do we as a team define that? Because if we don't know what that is, how are we going to allow it to auto-approve? Because, for example, you get dependency bots where they will go and go, you're using that library, I can see there's a new version of that, I'll try upgrading that library, and if nothing breaks, we might as well just auto-approve that because you're keeping up to date. What you're not doing with that is necessarily looking at what the change was in the library to know whether you want to accept that into your project. So again, this whole revolution is, for me, helping us start to go back to basics and actually having the conversations about what good looks like that we weren't having. But the caveat here is when we get too giddy about what this could do and allow it the keys to the kingdom and go, yeah, it'll be fine, just go for it. Because potentially we're at a point now where capability can go faster than governance. Now, what we've ended up with is like around each of these roles now, there's the potential for you to connect tools like to source control, or you've got things going off to browsers to get stuff. The potential for this to actually become ungovernable in the sense that you're not quite sure what they're all doing in your name is very quickly here. The risk is not the agent writes ugly code anymore. The risk is that you are giving it the wrong authority to do the wrong things with the wrong tools. One of the things that I was writing and helping write training material for was things around, you are effectively leaving your unlocked laptop with a junior developer, and if you have a load of production CLI keys, potentially, and you're also saying to it, knock yourself out, just type whatever command, and because it always makes me laugh that OpenAI's agent full access mode has an alias called YOLO. And so it's almost at that point where, are we actually saying that we're okay with it YOLOing on your laptop without you knowing what it's doing? Especially as, yes, you could argue that in the chat history it will show you what it did do, but that's after it's done it, not before it's done it potentially. So we're no longer in necessarily the world of harmless assistance if we allow it free rein access to everything that our laptop can do. So basically, you could argue bad code is recoverable, but unintended or unapproved actions are now a governance problem. I imagine that the citizen developer or solo developer doesn't give much of a care about this kind of stuff because they're going to see the speed improvement that this is offering, and therefore they're just going to go with it and get very excited. And I think a lot of the noise that we're seeing at the moment is because people are trying it out on things that don't matter and getting very excited about it. And now what we're talking about in this talk is where we're able to use it in enterprise kind of things. And I suppose where this was most recently seen was OpenClaw, where this idea that you could run an agent on a box, give it access to all of your tools, browser. I mean, people have been giving it access to even the banks and all this kind of stuff. You know at some point somebody's going to get their bank account cleared out by this kind of thing. But it was the fact that also this had a plugin ecosystem that allowed skills to be downloaded into OpenClaw. And people started to realize that those things were not being vetted and validated, that potentially could have vulnerabilities in them themselves. So now you've got the risk. OWASP now have a list of, we've used OWASP for years of guidance of what bad smells might be. OWASP are now starting to do LLM guidance as well. So, so the analogy slightly is the fact that we've effectively given a kid a pair of scissors and it's running with it. A lot of the excitement that we're seeing in the blogs and around the use cases is we've removed the friction. We're okay with it asking for permission so frequently. We are allowing it to run more commands than just basic Git and file listing and amending text files. Suddenly you're now giving it browser control. Suddenly you're now giving it tool access, and it's, to use that more modern phrase than I am, to let it cook. And it kind of feels like it does create moments of incredible speed, but it also creates moments where nobody can quite explain what the boundary was or should have been if we're not careful. So you can understand the enterprise tension, which is, yeah, startups optimize for speed, and startups are going to make dents in problem spaces. I mean, I was reading a news article this morning where mathematicians had a bet. There was one mathematician last year that said, "Oh, I don't think an AI will outperform me until 2030," and he's now gone back on that promise. But it's kind of like startups are going to make real use of this because they've got less to lose. I think when you've got regulated clients in regulated industries, or potentially just people with more skin in the game to actually not want something to destroy their reputation by bad governance, it's understandable why these kind of topics are coming up now. So the concern is rational in the sense that if you've got client systems with privileged credentials on machines that we're running this on, if you've got contractual obligations to think about where you should or should not use AI, if you've got need to actually provide evidence trails of what has changed or what is being done in a client's name or in your name. So that line of actually having to leave, I don't think enterprises are objecting to AI helping them go faster. I think they're worried that they're running at a speed where they don't understand it. And so we need that convenience of how do we contain this? And a phrase that I keep using is blast radius. In other words, yes, it's powerful, but how do you stop the explosion going too far? And it kind of feels like the more tools you connect, the bigger the potential blast radius is, in the sense that you've got the potential, like with the OpenClaw example, of going too far if you're not careful. So it potentially expands the attack surface if you're not careful, and that you need to, that some emerging practices and some things that happen by default, cloud agents are effectively running in developer sandboxes without you having to go to the bother of setting up Docker or another container on your local machine. So in some ways, the cloud agent of being able to do something and go, go and try that elsewhere on your infrastructure, do the thing, and come back to me with the pull request is actually quite a good way of containing the blast radius. If you're doing this on a local machine and giving it access to go and run commands, your blast radius isn't as protected. So there are things now with like Codex and from OpenAI where you can get it to use a sandbox every time. You can set it up, or you could even just decide, I'm only going to use this tool from within a sandbox deliberately so that you actually control that edge. It's a choice to basically say, instead of me actually putting this in place for my production path to live, I could just run a spike off to the side. I could use this to validate something. You know, we've always had that thought that if I used to use that approach instead of this approach, we would be faster. Well, maybe you can actually go and try this now. That's the difference. What we're not saying is necessarily AI should be used for your main day job, but this could actually accelerate your thinking around what could you do around it. So it feels to me like there's three main failure modes that we're seeing at the moment, which is, have you given it too unclear a task to actually understand what it should or shouldn't be doing? In other words, can you really complain that the AI did something bad if you haven't guided it properly? Have you given it access to more things than it needs? Where we've had the concept of zero trust in security for years, give it least privilege as possible. We should be thinking the same with AI tooling, and some people are wanting to give it access to everything because they're going, hey, here's $100, go and make me some money on the stock market and see how it goes. Fair enough. But I think in some ways, missing audit trail at the moment where a lot of is happening is you've got a chat history, but if you've been talking to an agent or multiple chats in OpenAI or Claude, you've then got to remember where that audit was. So in some ways, what I'm starting to see is that you need to define as well, not just the task of what is being done, but also what you expect the output to be so that you can help understand what was done. So, can the agent do it is the wrong question because more and more as these models get tuned to being, especially as they're clearly solving developer problems which are easier for it to understand because code is potentially, you could argue, less ambiguous than human speech or writing a legal text or whatever. The question actually is, under what authority, using which tools and leaving what evidence have I set this up to do the thing I want? In other words, have I just thought and got excited about the fact that it could do it, but actually have I set it up correctly? So don't give it more power without necessarily thinking, where are my boundaries? So potentially what we need to get to do together is actually define why we're wanting one in the first place. And that's also where we want multiple. Like, why do we want to have multiple viewpoints or approaches codified to actually do this? Like, what's the benefit of us spending the time to actually do that? Define the tool boundary. What am I allowing it to touch? Be explicit about that rather than just saying, oh, I've kind of forgotten what I've installed on my laptop, so it'll just have access to anything it wants. Or potentially it's got the access to install anything it wants. That's the other thing, of course. It can go off and go, I fancy using this new library. I will go to NPM and install it. And you're going, maybe you could have asked. And maybe you should be explicit about when it should ask. What are the output contracts? What are the artifacts it should leave behind? Make it explicit about what evidence you want as a deliverable. Who must sign off on these changes or the tooling being used in this way? In other words, you are introducing risk potentially if you don't have these discussions, but also when do you want to be asked by the agents? There's a fascinating plugin for Visual Studio Code that works with Claude where, because agents tend to go off and do a task for a long time, they've invented a pixel office, like a pixel art office, and these little characters are walking around. And so when your character is busy doing a work, it's an agent task going off and doing stuff. And so basically you've got now a visual representation of your swarm of things happening in a graphical computer game kind of format. I've not got unfortunately I didn't put the screenshot in there, but it's a fascinating extension. But again, that idea of approval points, you might be going, oh, that's cute, it's busy doing something, but when do you want it to stop and actually ask? And the critical bit, which often we skip over when we're in greenfield or new development, is how do I recover? How do I roll back? What do I do to actually get out of jail free, if there is such a thing? So potentially, we will need to think about writing a role definition card for each of these things. So what is its mission? So if you were doing a security review agent, because that's not your strength potentially, you might want to identify places where passwords are used or authentication. You might want to, have I got secrets being saved into the source control? How am I doing handling of handshaking? What are my dependency risks? Tools, you might say, well, what tools do I want to use to analyze this kind of stuff? What am I forbidding you to do? What should you not do? Like, are you not wanting me to allow you to merge to the main branch? Because actually you've got the ability with Git to do that, but I'm saying you shouldn't do that. What are the outputs I want? What notes do I want to leave? And who is the owner, and how much should they be involved is another thought around that, because it kind of feels like agents then don't get deployed as vague personalities. They have a justification of why they exist, and therefore it's easier to understand why you've gone to the bother of doing this. So when we're looking at role types, we might want to think about, what don't you want this to do? How we should do security by design, in the sense of saying, read only by default, write access where only justified, using developer sandboxes where we want. I mean, that works for coding tasks where potentially we might do, but also if we get more people in the business excited about this technology, like, can you review this document? Can you look at these business requirements and do they make sense? What are the questions I am not asking that you think I should be asking the stakeholder? Those kind of things. Dev sandboxes don't necessarily translate to a lot of other things, but you also might want to think, I should have a copy of that file that I'm reviewing in case it wants to change it. And again, it's back to how do I protect myself? So dev containers aren't the complete answer, but as a concept, it's about saying, what would I want, if it did go wrong, would I be okay with that? How do I narrow the damage an enthusiastic agent can do? Right, and then the output bit is important in the sense that, what do I want it to spit out? Do I want it to say what it felt like it had done in terms of meeting acceptance criteria? Did we even provide acceptance criteria? Are we wanting it to update architecture decision records? This whole thing actually starts to make you think, or it makes me think anyway, should project documentation live in the same repository as the code? So instead of all this being divorced in a separate wiki somewhere else, actually, if your architecture decision records, your test plans, your risks log and everything was in something that the tool could amend, then actually one of the things that developers historically have always been tarred with is a lack of excitement about producing documentation. Well, lo and behold, you can now say to an agent, even if it's not changing it, you could just say, can you go and review and see whether are there any code changes that we've made that go against our decision that we've made previously in this project. So for me, it feels like it's not just about getting better outputs and more structured outputs. It's about saying that your decision making becomes more obvious, and all of this has the unique benefit, in my opinion, which is you're onboarding a new human team member. They've now got all of this to look through. It's no longer having to be absorbed by, oh no, we don't do it that way, over 6 months. You can now say, well, actually, we all work, whether we're virtual or human, in this way in this team. And so for me, it's actually about time that we went back to basics in some way. So the human doesn't need to type every line anymore, but the human does still need to own where we might have ambiguity in the requirements or what we're asking it to do. What are the ethics of using this or the approach that the AI has decided to take? what are the trade-offs and accountability? And those are unique things that humans should still be proud of the fact that we are better placed to do than spending the time to try and get an AI agent to do that in our name. So let's swarm compress the sort of churn in labour of actually getting a change done, not necessarily remove responsibility. That's not what we're saying here. So in some ways, what we're saying is, yes, there is speed in this potentially once you've got up to speed with this. Yes, it could do things in parallel if you're defining more than one agent and swarming on a task. Yes, you could start to define what a specialist viewpoint might be to get another opinion, even if that opinion is virtual, and potentially that things coordinating, be that with external MCP servers or other systems that might expose themselves as NCP, like for example, Azure DevOps now has an MCP server, so potentially you could connect an AI agent to Azure DevOps to say, can you give me an idea of the kind of tickets that are cropping up most frequently? Lo and behold, we suddenly start getting coordination latency becoming, and latency in that case isn't networking, it's just about the time it takes you to actually get an answer. But then the risks are obviously that you have the false confidence that it's going to just do it right every time. You've got the potential that it could, if you weren't keeping an eye on it, would it continue to drift away from what you thought it was going to do? Could tools in your environment be misused by the agent? Is it just doing things blindly without leaving a trail of crumbs to understand what it did? And have you not necessarily had the conversation about where responsibility should lie? So to sort of bring it back together, I can see a massive benefit of this, not least because it's actually forcing us to have conversations about what good looks like. I'm against this idea of ambient authority, the idea that it just happens by default, like whatever's there should just happen. It's actually forcing better conversations. It continues to change software delivery from the foundations that ChatDev and Meta GPT did years ago to say that this was possible. So a lot of this, is just public interest rather than it actually being anything particularly new. It's just now got to a critical mass where these things are being talked about. I do think virtual specialization has its place, not least because you might want times where you can work on things yourself. I think winning organizations will learn to orchestrate AI teammates if they want to, but it doesn't necessarily have to, because it's not about replacing the individual, it's about learning from it. But I also don't think that YOLO mode with production credentials is a strategy, even though some people are probably walking into that blind at the moment. So I feel the strongest outcome from this is having project standards, patterns, practices, decisions, all becoming living documentation within the project code base, not detached in that faraway wiki. We've gone beyond the first horizon already where people are getting assistance from AI individually. We're kind of moving towards coordinated virtual teams, which is kind of where this talk is pitched at the moment. Is there a chance that we might start to see organizations effectively allowing code to be pushed almost as survivable experiments to production, to learn from users' experience and actually do the whole software delivery lifecycle autonomously? That's a risk-based decision, and whether there's sufficient trust and guardrails to allow that to happen. But I'm sure somebody will be doing that. And it feels like GitHub Copilot and other tools are moving towards this already as a multi-agent hub model. The idea is that they're not trying to say you must use Microsoft Copilot. They're actually saying, here are a load of models, we will help you coordinate them. So even we're starting to see hints from GitHub that we're getting to a coordination layer point of view. So the future of software delivery may not be one AI pair programming per human, like we've had for a couple of years. It may be one human leading their own small software-defined team. It might be that we're able to actually allow people to do that. That might be risky in the sense that we then might have people just doing their own siloed work without talking to each other again. But the guardrail there might be that if everybody's using the same shared definitions of what good looks like, that may be de-risked slightly because of that. So the question is no longer whether AI agents can join the team. The question is whether we know how to be its engineering manager. And that might not be what some people have signed up for. It might be that actually this all feels like heavyweight, oh, do I have to think about all this kind of stuff? I just want to get it done and actually profit. But in some ways, we are actually at a point where we have to understand what it's doing in our name. So yes, use these systems to at least better understand them. Experiment. Exploit the parallelism if you think it suits your problem. But in enterprise settings, don't confuse speed with control, because it might come with unintended consequences if you don't think about it. I found this quote and I thought I liked it a lot. Design AI role boundaries as carefully as you do design APIs. In some ways, if we're putting control in place and saying, I will only accept requests of this type, I will only allow you to authenticate, why are we not doing that similarly with this? And equally, design permissions as carefully as you design infrastructure. In other words, what is the least privilege that I'm going to give you access to? How do I know that this is okay? Force those decision trails into inspectable artifacts. Don't just leave it to chat history. Make sure that if you are having chat history and you think it's important as a record of what you asked it that other people working on the same bit would need, maybe you need to save the chat history into source control as well. But again, you have to think then that you've got a long, verbose thought process that might not be easily digestible. So that's why I was talking about outputs earlier. And then continue to keep humans owning the ambiguity, the why are we doing this, and making those release decisions about when good has been reached, when sufficiently quality has got to. So that is swarm programming as I see it at the moment, and thank you very much for your attention. Cheers everyone online. I shall stop the recording.